Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to the 2020 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. This is Katie Parker. I work as the educator for Adams, Brown, Hancock, Pike, and Schuyler counties in Western Illinois, and I will be your moderator today during this presentation on spring and summer bulbs for cut flower production. This presentation is being recorded, and Zach will email a link of the archived presentation as soon as possible after this concludes. We do ask that you remain muted with your video off for the recording. There will also be a link for a very short online evaluation of this presentation included in that email, and we would very much appreciate your feedback. I will also try to start sharing a screenshot of the QR code that links to the survey at the end of each webinar, so you can use a smartphone to scan that QR code and it will take you directly to the evaluation. Today we are using Zoom's meeting platform for this presentation. For those of you that are not familiar with it, there is a poll currently on your screen that you should be able to click on for your webinar toolbar. There you will find a voluntary and anonymous demographic form that would be very helpful for us in Extension. You'll also find a chat section, which is for questions that you have for the presenter. We will ask those questions at the end of the webinar to the presenter. So if you have any questions throughout, please leave those in the chat box. So this week's presentation is from Candice Hart. Candice is a State Master Gardener Specialist with the University of Illinois Extension, providing leadership to the Illinois State Master Gardener Program. She holds a bachelor's degree in horticulture and a master's degree in ag education, both from the University of Illinois. Candice currently lives in Bloomington, Illinois, where she grows cut flowers for the Bloomington Farmers Market, as well as her own retail and wedding customers. Candice serves as president of the Illinois State Forest Association and is also a certified floral designer and Illinois certified professional florist. So with that, I will hand it over to Candice to learn some about cut flower production.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it. Glad to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is flowers. Like you mentioned, I kind of come to flowers from a design perspective. So I'm always looking at certain things to grow that I can use in particular floral designs, especially for weddings and farmers markets. So that's kind of the angle that I tend to come towards things when it comes to cut flower growing. But today we're talking specifically about spring and summer bulbs for cut flower production. These are some of my favorite things to add into the things that I grow for cut flowers. So I'm excited to talk about some of these with you. Many of them you're probably already familiar with, but hopefully you'll get some tips and tricks on making your production better, or even just adding them into your production cycle. So this is my little corner of paradise here. Like I mentioned, I'm in Bloomington, so I'm in central Illinois. I grow mostly in raised beds. You can see behind my house there, I have a whole bunch of very tall maples. So my full sun spots are a little bit limited on where I can grow a lot of cut flowers. So I tend to kind of add a couple more raised beds every year in those areas where I can grow. So I'm definitely a very small scale flower grower, but a lot of things we'll talk today can certainly be scaled up to larger production. So these are some of my raised beds. I also grow quite a few things in landscape beds wherever I can. Again, I'm always just trying to maximize the full sun locations that I have in my area. So I will put some cut flowers just about anywhere I can. So that's my little corner of growing space. So why grow bulbs? That's what we're talking about today. And I use the term bulbs as a general term. We're talking about things that aren't specifically botanically bulbs necessarily, but we use bulb as just kind of a general term for any type of fleshy storage organ that is below ground. So any of those would kind of fall under this large umbrella of bulbs. So a couple reasons why I think bulbs are great to add into your production is their ease of planting. So for the most part, most of these, whether you have a way to dig a trench or you have a bulb drill where you can drill individual holes, or we're also even going to talk about some crepe production, the ease of planting is really pretty good on most of these, and it's pretty quick planting time. There also tends to be a fairly quick turnover on a lot of these crops, especially we'll talk about some of that crepe production. You can get a quick crop through on a relatively fast basis. We'll talk about a couple of perennial options, which I love, like I said, to mix into the landscapes that I can just cut on them from year to year, not have to worry about replanting every season. And I think they're really great at filling in some of the gaps of the season where maybe your annuals aren't quite ready yet in the spring. That's when I rely on a lot of my specifically perennials to fill in that time frame so I can have things for Mother's Day and those earlier spring occasions when a lot of the annuals just aren't quite there yet. So we'll talk about a lot of those as we go through. So a couple of the options we're going to discuss today, we're going to look at some spring flowering bulbs that you would plant in the fall, and they would flower in the spring. And then we're also going to talk about what we kind of categorize as summer bulbs, which typically as a broad term means that these are the type of bulbs that we're going to plant in the spring once things are warm enough, and we're going to harvest them throughout the season. But then for the most part, most of them are not going to be perennial. So we would either need to treat them as an annual or dig them up and store them for some of these cases. So we'll talk about some storage tips on some of these as well. Okay, so our first crop here in that spring flowering bulb category would be tulips. This is probably in my top 5 for sure of cut flowers to grow because really they're pretty darn easy, and from a labor standpoint, it's not too bad. And it's an early season crop, which I'm always here for. So I grow these in my raised beds. Botanically speaking, tulips are a true bulb. And for the most part, for cut flower production, we're actually going to be growing tulips as an annual. So tulips, of course, are a perennial for us here in Illinois. We could plant the bulbs and have them come back on a yearly basis, but we'll talk about why we basically treat them as an annual for cut flower production. So planting time on these is going to be in the fall. So whenever you are planting your spring flowering bulbs, that's when you're going to plant your tulips. Typically what we say is about the time of the first frost. Once the ground starts to cool down, that's usually when we're shooting to put tulips in the ground, because what you want in the fall is you want a little bit of time for them to get some roots growing, but you don't want to plant them too early that they are starting to sprout and kind of shoot some of that growth up. So you really do want to wait till around that time of frost so that they can just get some roots going. Now, I'm talking specifically about growing them outdoors in beds. You can also purchase pre-cooled tulip bulbs, and I know several growers that do that. So any of these spring flowering bulbs are going to need a cold treatment in order for them to bloom. So when you plant them outside, of course, winter is giving you that cold treatment. But let's say, for example, you wanted to plant these tulips in a hoop house because maybe you wanted to have them earlier. You really wanted to make sure you had them for Mother's Day or Easter or something like that. You can purchase pre-cooled bulbs from the supplier that have already gotten that cold treatment. Obviously, you're going to pay a little bit more for that, but if the timing works out and you would rather do that, you certainly can. So spacing wise, really you're going to pack these in as tight as you can. So I think I have a picture in here of my raised beds. Basically, you're putting those bulbs side to side. Since we're harvesting all of this, we're not treating them as perennials. We really don't need to do the typical spacing like you would do on a standard tulip bulb. We're not giving them 6 inches or so spacing. We're going to pack them in really pretty tight, and we're going to cover them with a couple of inches of soil. Watering on these, of course, you're going to need some supplemental watering in the fall if you're not getting that from rain. Like I said, you want to get those roots established. in the fall. So if you're not getting much rain, you do want to give some supplemental watering. Otherwise, you let them go for the winter. So really easy in terms of care. So here's that raised bed. I think this was from last fall. When I put my bulbs in, essentially for my raised beds, what I do is just dig out a couple of inches of soil, toss it over to the next bed over, flatten things out, come through, lay out all my tulip bulbs, label everything. And of course, you're going to put that bulb with the pointed end up and the basal plate is down so that the roots are going to go down, and then cover that with a couple of inches of soil. So you can do the same thing in the ground. You're essentially going to dig out a trench that you can place all of those tulips out then, and then cover them back up with soil. And that's it. There's no staking. There's no extra anything required. That's why I love these. It's a fairly simple planting. The only downside to me is that usually by the time it's time to do these, I'm really over it. It's like October and I'm like, okay, I need a break. I'm done with flower farming. So sometimes it's kind of hard to muster that energy to get this last kind of thing done before you head into that winter break season, but it's really worth it in the spring. Okay, so here's one of mine from, I think this was from last season. So in terms of varieties, you've got a lot of options when it comes to tulips. You can choose single varieties, you can choose doubles. That would have been a more of a double type, that previous one. You can choose varying flower times. There's early cultivars, there's late cultivars, and I try to choose a combination of both, that I can kind of space out my harvest time a little bit. And just my personal preference, I prefer to grow more unique varieties. So I prefer to only grow doubles or parrot types for the most part, because to me, it all depends on your audience, but to me, a single tulip, you're not going to get the market value from that when you can get a single tulip very cheap from the grocery store, from the wholesaler. What you want to do is make your tulips unique, something that they can't get from everywhere. So I find doing the tulips, the doubles, and the parrots will really set your tulips apart, especially if you're going to be selling to florists. They're going to want those unique types of tulips. So play around, find the ones that you prefer. Harvest time on those, you're going to harvest when just a little bit of color is peeking out. So that, back to this photo here, that one there, a big one in the center, would be too far open. Obviously, I would still harvest it, but that's not where we want to really harvest if we're going to want to hold these for a period of time. We want more so the ones in the back where they're just starting to show some color. And the goal here is to have as long of stem as possible, especially if you're going to be selling to florists. Stem length is key. So the reason that we treat this as an annual essentially is that when we harvest, we're going to pull the whole bulb. We're going to pull the bulb with the stem attached. One reason is to get as long of stem as possible. The second reason is that it allows us to store those stems for a period of time. So if I leave the bulb on, now I have a food source for those stems, and I can harvest them. I can lay them in the cooler. I can wrap them up. The key is that you keep the stems upright or straight and away from light. Tulips are phototropic. They're going to bend towards the light. So you either want to make sure they're upright and there's no sunlight that they can reach to, or you need to lay them flat in a dark box or a crate. But if you have those bulbs on there and they're in the cooler, you can hold those for several weeks at least. So if you're trying to time for a specific holiday, that is super helpful. Okay, so here's some in varying stages. We're looking for ones that are just starting to show some of that color and are just starting to open up. So you'd come in at that point, I would just put my hand at the base of that stem and just pull straight out, pull the whole bulb along with it. Okay, now some of you might ask, well, what do you do with the bulb then? So obviously, once you're ready to sell those stems, you're going to cut the bulb off right above where the bulb is. You're going to cut it off, clean off the stems, get rid of all the extra soil that might be on there, and then you're going to bunch them typically in bunches of 10. So since you've cut off all of the foliage, from that bulb. You really can't replant it. There's no way for that bulb to have energy stored back into it because there's no leaves still. So those just go on the compost pile. So that's where I'm saying these are grown as an annual. We're not leaving that bulb in the ground or replanting that bulb. Now, you certainly could, if you had a long enough stem and you're able to harvest it without the bulb to get extra stem, you certainly could space them out and replant them. But for the most part, it's simplest and easiest to treat those as an annual crop. Okay. Love tulips. Next up, daffodils. Daffodils are also true bulbs. And this one you're typically going to grow as a true perennial crop. So you're going to plant those tulip bulbs in the fall, just like we did the tulips, spring flowering bulbs, plant in the fall. And the key for these, in my opinion, is to choose some unique varieties. So you can certainly grow just your standard bright yellow daffodil with the yellow petals and the yellow center. Certainly that's going to sell. But again, especially if you're selling to florists or whatever your market is, any unique color combination or even a doubled variety, an heirloom variety is going to give you kind of an advantage in terms of selling those. Okay. Your spacing is going to depend on the size of the bulb and also kind of how long you're planning to have those in the ground. So if you're going to treat these as a true kind of perennial crop, I'm probably going to space my bulbs about 6 inches apart. That's going to allow room for those bulbs to continue to multiply. And over the years, you're going to get bigger and bigger clumps of those daffodils, which is kind of what you want, since we can treat this as a true perennial crop. Just like the tulips, you're going to want to water in the fall if there's not much rain happening to make sure those roots are getting established. But after that, once they're established, no need for really much extra care at all. So here's the one. I didn't have a lot of great daffodil pictures from my gardens, but this is one that I tucked into arrangement this last spring. I think these were the Easter arrangement. So you can see white petals with a yellow center, just something different than the standard yellow on yellow. So the great thing to me about daffodils is that you can stick them in places that you normally wouldn't be growing much else. So again, I didn't have a great picture, but along this, this is my studio here in the background here. I grow my daffodils basically along the whole backside of this studio, anywhere I can tuck them into landscape. And you can see this is my backyard that's heavily shaded by those tall maples. But the great thing about spring flowering bulbs is that they're going to come up before the trees have leafed out, and they're able to photosynthesize for a good amount of time before they're fully shaded by those trees. So if you have a woodland area, this would be a great place to tuck in daffodil bulbs. And then once they're established, really it's just, you just let them go. You harvest when you need. So that's another thing I love about these guys. So just like tulips, you want to harvest them when they're just kind of starting to crack open and show some color. They're going to continue to open after you cut them. You can certainly cut them when they're fully open. You're just going to have a shorter vase life, and there's more risk of getting damaged in the flower bucket and things like that. So to get as long a stem on these guys, since we're leaving the bulb in the ground, you can harvest by kind of putting your hand at the base of the stem and pulling up gently. That'll give you a little bit more stem length. But in general, these aren't going to be the longest stemmed flowers. That's just kind of how daffodils naturally are. Once you do harvest, you're going to want to harvest them all into the same bucket of water, because they do release a sap that goes into the water, and it's going to run out of that stem once you've made a fresh cut. So as long as they're in a bucket all by themselves, that's fine, but they can decrease the vase life of other flowers that are in the same water. So a good tip is to always, if you're going to use a daffodil in another vase with other flowers or another arrangement, is to put them in that bucket of water, let the sap run out, and when you put it in another vase, do not recut the stems. Okay, you want that stem to be kind of sealed over so that it's not going to let more of that sap into the water. Okay. So that's our daffodils. Another two that I just popped in here just as an idea to think about would be hyacinth and lily of the valley. These would also be spring flowering bulbs. They're not going to be major cut flower crops. I'm not going to sell bundles of these at the farmer's market, anything like that. But if you're selling for, let's say, Mother's Day, or you're selling specifically directly to florists, these are some of those unique things that they're going to eat up, especially lily of the valley. If they have spring weddings, being able to get lily of the valley locally versus having it shipped over from Holland for buku bucks is going to be a great thing. Obviously, any of these are going to be a very short season, so we're not talking about a huge kind of profit or crop of these. But if you can kind of supplement a couple of things in that early spring, then why not? And again, these are perennials, so you can just kind of let them harvest every year. Okay, so those are some of our spring bulbs. Hopefully that gives you some ideas there of things to try for those bulbs. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about what we call, like I said earlier, kind of this anecdotal term of summer bulbs. So we're going to start with lilies. Lilies are also true bulbs that we're going to plant. And I was lucky enough to get some great info from my flower farmer friend Drew at Clara Joyce Flowers. He has a farm up in Stockton, Illinois, amazing grower. And he had some great information he shared with me on crate production of lilies in particular. I wish I had a hoop house or a greenhouse. I wish I didn't have these trees. I was able to do that, but I cannot. And that is how he produces the majority of his lilies, is he has a great hoop house greenhouse set up. And specifically, he grows those lilies in crate production, which is what I'm going to show you here. So he grows mostly OT and LA hybrid lilies. So when you're looking for varieties, those are the hybrids that he tends to recommend. Spacing wise, he's putting about 18 to 24 bulbs per crate, and he's ordering pre-cooled bulbs. Okay, so that's the key when you're looking for your suppliers. These are going straight into the hoop house to grow immediately, so they need to be pre-cooled. With his crates, and I'll show you a picture next of the crates, he's got about 2 to 3 inches of potting mix on the bottom. He's spacing the bulbs out with the roots down, and then an extra 2 to 3 inches of potting mix on the top. You're going to water only when needed. So obviously you're going to water at first to get some roots going, and then as needed after that. And especially in a hoop house or greenhouse, airflow is going to be essential. So definitely having fans and air movement going is going to be very important when it comes to that. So he recommends arranging for several ship dates, so you can really have a succession kind of planting going of a crop like this. And in terms of production time, LA types are going to take about 60 to 65 days to flower. OTs, which would be something like a stargazer lily would be in that category, is going to take a little bit longer. And then I love in particular rose lily varieties, which are more of a doubled, a lot more petals to it, are going to take even longer. So you're going to kind of time your harvest by what your kind of production date is. If you're shooting for Mother's Day or farmer's market or whatever your kind of market is, you can time it based on that, which is kind of nice. You're going to harvest when two buds are in color. So let me see if I have a picture of, see if I have one coming up. Just like tulips, just like the daffodils, they're going to open after you cut them. So as long as there's some color peeking out of those buds, that's what we're going for. That's going to give you the least amount of damage in the flower bucket as you're moving things around. So here's a couple pictures from Drew here that he shared with me. So he has these bulb crates basically side to side across the table in the greenhouse, and he's planting those lily bulbs there on the left, and you can see them starting to come up there on the right. And then you can see some of that awesome stem length that he gets out of those in the crates. So that's what we're looking for on the left, when just that white color is just starting to show up on the buds. That's a great harvest time for those. And then obviously the one on the right would be, we wouldn't want to harvest that particular flower. We'd cut it off if we're going to harvest it, but just beautiful lilies. Love those. Okay. So that would be growing those in crates. That's, I think, a great way to do it. And if I had the space, I would most definitely be growing a whole bunch of lilies in that space. But for me, for my production area, what I do is just mix those lilies into the landscape. So lily bulbs are indeed perennials if you leave them in the ground, most of these. So that's what I do. I tuck them into the landscape. And the downside, of course, is I only have one harvest. It's a very short window of harvest based on what the weather is like in the spring and summer, but I still get a great harvest off of them, and I can harvest from year to year. The key is that when I do harvest, I make sure not to cut it all the way back to the ground and need to leave a little bit of foliage there so that that bulb can store up energy and do it all again next year. So these are a couple that I've just grown in landscape beds, but still a great option if you don't have the ability to try out some crate production. And this next one, Drew is also kind enough to share with me. He also has a great success growing callas, which would be another type of bulb, and specifically a tuber. So he also grows calla lilies in bulb crates. He puts about six bulbs per crate. And what's nice about these is that naturally they can grow in a more shaded area. So they're actually a great way to utilize some space in that greenhouse, as you wouldn't normally really be able to grow anything. So I'll show you a picture. He basically just puts these crates underneath his benches and just kind of gets double the amount of production space. So soil wise, it's similar to the lilies, 2 to 3 inches on the bottom, 2 to 3 inches on the top, and very similar watering and airflow specifications. Grow time is going to be about 55 to 60, and then another 30 to 35 for bloom. So you can kind of time that based on, again, when you're wanting them. And callas is one of those that is not going to open after you harvest it. So back to that first picture, you're going to harvest them when they're essentially at the stage that you want to sell them in. So depending on what your market is, if you're marketing to florists, they're going to want that calla looking great so they can pop it into arrangement right away. And I would say this crop, probably not a crop that you're going to use much space for if you're just going for retail, so let's say a farmer's market. But if you are growing specifically for florists and florists that do weddings in particular, this would be an awesome crop, and I'm sure they would eat it up from a local source. So it's definitely more of a higher end kind of crop. But here you can see Drew's production there. He has all of those calla lily crates just lined up underneath the benches, and you can see the great production he's getting there off of those callas. So definitely, this isn't a crop that I've experimented with yet. So definitely reach out to Drew at Clara Joyce Flowers is the name of his farm. He's on Instagram, and I'm sure he'd be happy to chat with you about any of that if you have questions. And I'll do my best to answer questions too. Okay, next up, probably the Mac Daddy of the summer bulbs in terms of cut flower production would be dahlias. Everybody loves dahlias, right? So dahlias are tuberous roots that are a true summer bulb. If I leave these dahlias in the ground at the end of the year, they're donezo. They are not hardy enough to make it to the next season here in Illinois. So that means if we want to plant that same dahlia every season, we need to dig it up, store it for the winter, and then replant in the spring. So if we're comparing this to, let's say, the tulips, in terms of labor and amount of effort put in, we're talking about quite a bit more labor and effort. But we're also talking about a really good high dollar crop, especially if, again, you're growing for florists. You're going to be able to get several dollars a stem for a lot of these. And even to the retail market, farmers market folks love these dahlias as well. So you kind of have to weigh your benefits. They're going to be a lot more labor intensive, but you're also going to get a higher dollar per stem. So planting time on dahlia tubers is going to be when the soil is warm to about 60 degrees. So this is not one of those early season crops. We're going to wait till after that danger of frost has passed. And that's when we're getting those dahlias in. Very cold sensitive. So we have to make sure it's warm enough in the spring. And then once we get that first frost in the fall, they are done. So really going to be best during that warm season. Spacing wise, we're going to plant the tuberous roots about 4 to 6 inches deep and space them about 12 to 18 inches apart so that you have good airflow and good spacing between the tubers. You're going to need staking for these guys. So this again goes into that labor factor. If you're growing these true kind of cut flower varieties, you're going to need some type of staking system. Some growers will use tomato cages on each individual tuber. Many will use what we kind of anecdotally call the corral method, where essentially you have stakes around the edges of the beds and you have string basically around the edge. You're kind of fencing in those dahlias so that they're kind of corralled in and they're supported amongst themselves. Okay, well-drained soil is going to be essential, so never plant dahlias in a low-lying area. There's been many a season where a heavy rain spring has rotted out a dahlia field. So be selective on where you are planting these. This is, again, why I love them in raised beds, because I don't have to think about that too much. They do require fairly consistent watering. If there's a period of drought, they are just simply not going to put on stems or many stems at all. So definitely consider a drip irrigation system set up so that you can have ultimate success. Harvest on these is also going to be when they're mostly open. They're not going to open after you cut those stems much. So do them when they're fully open, but also keep an eye that they're not too fully open. They're not overly ripe. So really pay attention to the back of the flower. If you're noticing some of those petals on the back are starting to fade, you may have kind of missed your window a little bit on this to market it to a consumer. The vase life on these is short. So if you are selling these to retail, you might need to do kind of some education campaigns or some information on the care cards that these are not going to last as long as some of our traditional cut flowers. That's just simply how dahlias are. But man, they are beautiful when you have them. So the reason I grow dahlias is mostly for my wedding work. So this is a cafe au lait dahlia here in that photo. That's specifically what I grow them for, because for wedding work, I don't need them to last 7 days. I need to harvest them on Thursday or Friday, and they need to look good for Saturday, and then I'm good. I've reached my goal. So just keep that in mind, is that they're not the longest stem or vase life of some of the other cut flowers you could grow, which is fine. You just need to kind of have that expectation in mind and have your customers' expectation in mind. But man, especially if you're growing for florists, they're going to eat up dahlias, especially in the key wedding colors. So pay attention to the trends. Cafe au lait, you could grow many, many, many cafe au laits, and you could probably sell about all of them because it's still a very popular color and people just love that big dinner plate size. So I grow a lot of this blush tone. I grow a lot of burgundies, a lot of whites, just because that's the common wedding colors. I'm not going to grow bright red or bright orange or bright yellow. I could if I was going to sell them at the farmer's market, but for weddings, that's just not going to be used too much. Okay. You can also make sure to have a good flower food or holding solution in your buckets. That's also going to help with the vase life a little bit. But yeah, just keep in mind that they're not going to ship well at all. And they're not going to have a super long vase life. Tons of varieties to pick from, just about any color range, and ranging from dinner plate size to smaller ball dahlias. There's daisy-like. There's a lot of options when it comes to dahlias. Okay. Like I mentioned, the staking, that's another reason I like the raised beds, is I can just kind of put my stakes around the outside and start adding string around the edges and just kind of corral those dahlias in. Okay. One thing I didn't put in here, which I want to mention, going back to the labor point on dahlias, is another labor point on these is going to be pest control. Japanese beetles are going to love these. Cucumber beetles are going to love these. They have a lot of great pests. So what a lot of growers will end up having to do is actually bag each individual flower bud, so you can get mesh kind of organza bags. Think about, really, they're designed for kind of wedding favors, that kind of like drawstring bag. And as the bud is just starting to come on, you put that bag around it and tie it up, and then you take it off once the flower is fully developed. That's really your best control for things like the cucumber beetles, because they will just eat holes all in your petals. So again, awesome flower, awesome crop, just something to think about in terms of the labor factor. Okay. And then once the season's over, okay, a lot of people always have questions about storing the tubers, the tuberous roots. So after we get that first frost and the foliage has died back, we're going to cut off that foliage. We're going to dig the tubers from the ground or from our beds. We're going to divide the clumps, keeping the largest and healthiest and firmest tubers for the next year, making sure that each of those tubers has an eye on it, a growing point. If it doesn't have a growing point, then that tuber's not going to sprout the next season. You want to wash those tubers well and allow to very thoroughly dry before it's time for storage. And there's a lot of ways people store dahlia tubers with varying degrees of success. So you can certainly play around with it if you haven't done it before. I find vermiculite to be a good choice. That's what I do a lot of times, is I'll fill a crate or a box with coarse vermiculite, and I will tuck the tubers into that. I have a couple of farmer friends who swear by the plastic wrap method. So after they're all divided and washed, they'll wrap each individual tuber with plastic wrap and label it to make sure they know what variety is. Some like coarse sand, some use sawdust. So there's a lot of methods for storage, but the key is that you are keeping moisture away from the tubers and you're keeping them cool. So you want them above freezing, but ideally below 50. So I particularly store mine actually in my cooler. I have a CoolBot cooler that's not on during the winter time, but it stays in like a 40-degree or so temperature because it's insulated and air still comes through the air conditioner. So I stick them in there and just let them hang out for the winter. But if you do not have a spot that's going to be that temperature, you're going to really struggle to store these for the next season. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay. And then I think this is my last one to mention was Gladiolus. Gladiolus are grown from corms. This is definitely one of those old-fashioned cut flowers, which again, you're going to plant once that soil has warmed up in the spring. Or another way to time it they recommend is about the same time that leaves start leafing out on the deciduous trees. So you can kind of think of that timing as well. You're going to space the corms about 2 to 6 inches apart, depending on the size of the corm. And the bigger the corm, obviously, the bigger the or the most marketable flowers you're going to have the first year. So keep that in mind when you are purchasing your corms and deciding what grade you're going to get. More than likely, you're going to need a staking system to keep those flowers upright. It's a very long and linear flower stem. They're going to prefer consistent water throughout the growing season. So drip irrigation is going to be recommended so that you can keep the flowers dry and not covered with a sprinkler system all the time. Okay, so this, of course, is what Gladiolus look like. Many of us are probably familiar with that old-fashioned, long, kind of vertical stem. So Gladiolus do have negative geotropism. So at all times, you always want to keep these stems upright if you're trying to have as straight a stem as possible. So for example, if that stem bends over in the field, the tip of that flower is still going to grow upright. So you're going to end up with a very crooked stem, which in some cases is fine. But if you're marketing, let's say to florist again, they're going to want a very straight stem. The amount of flowers open is also going to depend on your market. So a florist, you're going to have probably most of those buds closed, just a little bit of color peeking out. But if I was going to sell them at the farmer's market, I would let them open a little bit farther so that the customer could kind of see the beauty of that flower and kind of know what they're purchasing. So you can harvest those with mostly closed florets, and you can store them in the cooler for a period of time as well too. So one that you can store a little bit as well. So I grow a couple of Gladiolus here and there, but not a ton. For me, I can't get kind of a good enough price for them to really justify it, especially at a farmer's market level. So it's not one that I devote a lot of space to, but it's a great flower. And especially if you're selling to a florist who is maybe doing a lot of sympathy work, things like that, everyday work, they would use quite a bit of Gladiolus. So it kind of depends on your audience. All right, either way, great flower and love them. I wanted to throw in just a couple of last ones here, just as I was going through pictures for this, just a couple of random ones that you can throw in to the landscape. I love Kerkosmia. I love it in the landscape, but I also harvest it quite a bit to mix into my mixed bouquets and my mason jars for the farmer's market. Just a great pop of red. So that's an idea for you. Peacock lilies are also a pretty one that you can mix in, same with blackberry lilies as well. So we're touching on just some of those main bulb production crops, but of course in the landscape, there's a lot of species of bulbs, and many of them are going to make cut flowers. And if you're not sure, just give it a test, harvest it at various stages, put it in a vase and see what the vase life is. Sometimes even if the flower itself does not last very long, being able to use the seed pods for texture in arrangements is also really good. Like this blackberry lily, for example, I would almost not harvest it at this stage, and I would wait for those blackberry looking seed pods to come on. Okay, so I'll finish it off with, again, just kind of some tips for harvesting. It's going to depend on the flower. It's always going to be good to harvest either late afternoon or evening when lots of food is stored up in that stem, or in the morning when there's going to be a lot of moisture still in the stem. So essentially just avoid hot middle of the day. That would be your least ideal time for cut flower harvesting. Cut the stems longer than needed. Stem length is always essential, especially if you're selling to florists. Always strip the stems, make sure there's no foliage. It's going to be below the water in the bucket. And as you're harvesting, you're placing into warm water and allowing them to uptake for at least a couple hours before moving to the cooler. Care and handling, always use clean everything, clean flower buckets, clean pruners, as much as we can prevent bacteria. And any location is great. So removing the foliage is going to do a big part of that. Use a flower preservative. There's a lot of different brands out there that you can use as flower food for your buckets. Definitely use them. Most things are going to benefit from that. And if not, then changing out the water daily in those buckets is going to be the second best tactic. Keep them cool. So if you have a flower cooler, that's obviously ideal. If you don't, try to have that turnover be pretty high so that you're not storing flowers for a long period of time. And then, like I said, changing out the water frequently is going to be super helpful. So I'll finish with a couple of resources before we go to some questions. So highly recommend the Association of Specialty Cut Flower Growers. ASCFG is going to be a super great resource. If you're not a member, definitely check that out. Just the Facebook group alone, I find to be worth the membership. Once you're a member, you get added to that group and you can ask questions in there, and it's just super great. The Illinois Specialty Growers Association and conference is also really beneficial. We've had some great cut flower tracks these last couple of years. That just happened in January, so you'll have to wait for next year, but definitely keep an eye on that. And then like she mentioned earlier, I'm the president for the State Forest Association. We don't have much education, of course, for flower farmers, but we're always looking to connect florists with farmers and share as much local product as we can. So you're welcome to check out our website as well. And then I'll finish then with just a couple of quick links to fact sheets that I reference and that you can reference on a lot of these crops. So that'll be available on the handout. Okay, I'm going to get to questions. There's also an evaluation link here that you can hit with your phone and head to that evaluation link. So I'm going to scroll back up here and see what we have for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Candice, for the fabulous presentation on spring and summer bulbs for cut flower production.
Yeah.
I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. I hope you got some information that will help you in your small farm endeavors. Hopefully something that you can even put in place yet this winter. So we'll go ahead and get into questions. So your first question, Candice, is how do you prevent tulips from molding?
Make sure they're as dry as possible. That usually if I have mold issues, it's because maybe I harvested after a rain and I didn't let the stems dry well enough. So if you need to, after harvest, lay those stems out and put a fan on them and make sure they're really dry. And then also you can then wrap those stems in newspaper, put them in a box. If you feel like the humidity is really high in your cooler, that can help as well. But yeah, keeping them dry is key.
The next question is, do they need full sun or can they handle some shade? And I think that was in regards to either the tulips or the daffodils.
Yeah, I think so too. Both of those would do fine with some shade because like I said, they come up so early in the spring, even before trees leaf out. So they would do fine with some shade. That's a great question.
Our next question is, I have some bulbs in the garage that did not make it into the ground last fall. Can I plant them into a pot now in the garage? I'm going to try, but any tips for that?
Yeah, if you take them out and they still feel like nice and firm, then yeah, those bulbs would be fine to plant now and see what happens. Obviously, if they were spring flowering bulbs and your garage wasn't cold enough, they're not going to flower because they didn't get that cold treatment. But yeah, if they still feel healthy and firm, you can certainly plant them. But if they feel squishy at all or dried up, then unfortunately, they've used up their kind of stored energy for the winter and you probably won't have much luck. It's a good question.
So we had a couple questions about where you like to buy your bulbs.
Yeah, I can't share one over the other, but I would direct you over to ASCFG, the American Association of Specialty Cut Flower Growers. That would be where I would send you. They have some good recommendations there, and honestly, just a good Google source. And if you're talking about cut flower production and large scale, then you're going to search for wholesale bulb companies, and you'll find quite a few options there.
And then for your raised bed, they're asking what size is that bed and how many bulbs did you plant?
Well, let me think. So that is it's 4 foot wide by 12 feet long. So each of those halves is 6 feet. And I think I planted about 1,000 bulbs this year. And I probably filled, let me try to think. I think I probably filled a full 12-foot area and maybe a little bit more. I honestly don't remember off the top of my head. But what you could do is if you're really trying to map it out, kind of figure out, okay, a tulip bulb is going to take up probably 2 square inches, 2 to 3 square inches. So you could do the math and figure out how many that would take to fill up your area peg. Yeah.
So our next question is, how deep do you plant your daffodils?
So the general recommendation is about 3 times the size of the bulb. So daffodil bulbs are fairly large. So we're usually talking about like 6 inches or so deep. So hopefully that helps. What I do is just follow whatever's recommended on the package for the most part.
How long does it take for the sap of daffodils to run out?
I would say give it at least a couple of hours. Once you make that fresh cut and you put it into water, yeah, I would say a couple hours. That again, that's not kind of a scientific answer. I don't know for sure, but to me, that would probably be the minimum that I would do. You might even wait overnight if you feel like you want to wait a little bit longer, but I've had pretty good success waiting a couple of hours and then taking those stems and then adding them to an arrangement without recutting it.
Where do you find or purchase crates for the crate production?
So do a search for bulb crates. That's going to get you the best. Drew had a couple of recommendations on his presentation. So I can see if I can find that out. But if you do a good Google search for bulb crates, that'll be your best bet.
And here's a good question. How do you protect your bulbs from animals?
A good question. So I'm lucky and I don't have a lot of bunny issues or deer issues where I'm at. But if you do have issues with things digging up the bulbs, squirrels, for example, chicken wire or some type of wire mesh over your planting bed would be your best tactic there. So if I needed to, I could put a wire mesh over the top of those raised beds if I had issues. Yeah, that would be your best tactic. Now, if you have problems with things coming from underneath, like voles, for example, do enjoy bulbs. Really, the only thing you can do there is try to trap those and catch them. There's not much you can do to kind of prevent that beyond trying to avoid those. But yeah.
For crepe lilies, when did you plant the chilled bulbs? Could you plant these in early winter for the chill period? These are they're asking, are these considered annuals when you're growing them in the crate?
Yeah, yep, exactly. If you are harvesting that whole stem and you're removing all of the foliage, then just like the tulips, you're treating them as an annual, and you're starting with a new batch of pre-cooled bulbs for every planting. And really the time, if they're chilled, you could plant them kind of whenever, especially if you have a hoop house or a greenhouse that you are putting them in. Yeah, and if we're talking about natural chill times, if you're putting them outside to get that chill time, then yeah, you could plant those in early winter. I'd have to look and see how many weeks of vernalization lilies need to tell you for sure. It would depend on that in terms of planting time.
So the next question is, what do you mean by root on top and smooth surface down?
Yeah, that was something that Drew recommended for those calla. So instead of having, typically you're going to have the basal plate down, which is where the roots are going to come out as that basal plate. For some reason, and I couldn't tell you the answer, I honestly don't remember from his presentation. He does the root part on the top. So definitely send him a message if you want to know more specifics about that. Callas was one that I don't have a ton of experience with. Yeah.
And I did a quick search for the cool period for lilies, and they suggest about 8 weeks.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so as long as you can give them that cool treatment either outside in the winter or even in a cooler, that would work. Yeah.
Someone made a comment about the bulb crates. They said a lot of times if you bulk order bulbs, they will send some crates with it, or they're shipped in them. So that's a great way of getting those.
Yeah, that is gold. Yeah.
Anything free helps. Are you doing any bed prep before or at the end of the season?
It depends which crop you're talking. If we're talking about, let's say, the dahlias, No, I don't do anything at the end of the season besides digging the dahlias and kind of filling back up the holes. And then the spring flowering ones, of course, you're going to be planting in the fall for most of the part. So that's when your bed prep is going to happen. So it kind of depends on which crop you're talking about. Yeah.
I think you covered this question. It was about the harvesting of the dahlias. If you grow these in the landscape, when it's harvest, when it's bloom.
Yeah, so in general, you're going to plant them probably, I would say most of the time it's warm enough by like Memorial Day, end of May, and you're really not going to expect much of a crop until July, probably at the earliest. And then you're going to get your peak production from like that August to October until it frosts.
And this next question, any tips to keep cucumber beetles from eating dahlia petals? You had mentioned use the mesh bags for that.
Yeah, that's really your best tactic. Yeah.
How long should dahlia stems be cut?
Depends on your market and who you're marketing them to. If it's for florists, then I would say as long as possible. If it's for retail, you could probably go a little bit shorter depending on how you're gonna sell them. I always like to cut back to where there's a new growing point, there's a new set of leaves. So it kind of just depends on the plant. But I'll tell you, you can hack dahlias back pretty far, and they're just gonna, as long as there's enough water, they're gonna keep flushing out for you.
Will lily bulbs replicate your perennial growing system? Do they divide, or do you divide them every few years?
You know, I haven't yet. The ones I have in the ground here in this spot, this will be, let me think, this will be probably season 4 for those. So I'm going to kind of see how they look this year. If I feel like I'm not getting many flowers anymore, or they're just not producing as well, I will probably, dig up and divide and respace things, because any type of bulb is going to put off bulblets to the side, and after a couple years it certainly can get crowded out. So yeah, I probably will need to do that every couple of years.
With dahlias, will they continue to set buds throughout the growing season, or do you succession plant?
Nope, you don't succession plant. Once it's warm enough, you get them all out there. Otherwise, it's going to take too long and you're not going to have much of a harvest towards the end of the season. So yeah, plant them all at once. And then like I just mentioned, after you cut that stem, you're going to have a new stem probably within a week's time. So they're going to keep, it's a cut and come again. You're going to keep cutting as long as the weather's warm enough and there's enough water.
Do you see any value in starting your dahlia tubers indoors and potting them up, then transplanting them as a growing plant to the field once risk of frost is done?
Yeah, if you have a small enough amount, I've definitely done that before. I've gotten like 6-inch pots and filled them all in my garage and potted up a bunch of the tubers and kind of gotten a head start on them. So yeah, I've definitely done that in the past if I have the space or the time. Now, if you're talking about a large scale, when you have a ton of tubers to put out, it's probably not feasible. But yeah, I think it has a benefit. And I've also even just done it with some tubers that I've kind of questionable, like, does this have an eye? Is this healthy enough? Sometimes I'll even just fill a whole crate with potting mix and I'll plant those tubers into that early in the season just to see if they're going to sprout, so that I'm not wasting time putting them in the ground and wasting area if I'm kind of unsure whether that tuber is actually gonna grow, for sure.
Do you treat your gladiolas as an annual?
Yeah, I usually do. You could definitely go in the fall and dig them up and store them like you would the dahlias, but to me it's a inexpensive enough bulb cost that to me it's not worth it. But if you had the time and you wanted to, you could definitely dig them and store them like you would dahlias.
Our next question is, do people buy tuberoses still? Have you ever grown?
That's a good one, Kelly. I haven't grown tuberose, but I love tuberose, and I definitely know some local fellow flower farmers who grow it, and I see them sell it at the farmers market, and I think some florists would definitely like it too. So yeah, that would be another good one to mix in. The fragrance on those is killer, so that's excellent.
How much sugar are you using for a vase?
So that's where you're going to want to use that pre-made flower preservative, that flower food, because it's going to have that pre-measured in it. I wouldn't recommend really, especially on a flower farmer scale, I wouldn't recommend making your own DIY kind of preservative. I would go for the pre-made Floralife or Crisol mixture. That's going to help you out there.
So dahlias and earwigs, are there any acceptable pesticides for cut flower use, or is bagging the primary method of pest control?
I would say bagging is going to be your go-to method. I'd have to look at, I don't have my pest control. We have a manual that you can kind of look at what's labeled for each crop, and I don't have that handy. So you'd have to see if there were any pesticides labeled for earwigs in that particular flowering crop. I'm sure there are. I tend to prefer to avoid the pesticides if I can, and either tolerate the damage or go for the bagging method.
Is the seed version of Dahlia sold by Johnny's Seed a viable alternative to Dahlia bulbs?
So you're not going to get a great crop the first season off of a seed dahlia. Okay, anything grown from a tuberous root, it's going to be a lot farther along in the process, and you're going to have a better harvest off of that, especially for cut flower production. So my recommendation would be to start with tuberous roots, or also I know what a lot of growers will do now is they will take cuttings off of their tuberous roots and they will start new plants that way. That is also, I think, a faster method to get it done. Yeah.
What do you recommend as a first or most financial purchase to start as a beginner in a 1 to 2 year period?
Kurt, I'm assuming you're asking about like which crops to start with. For me, if I was just starting out, I would start with tulips, because that's an easy, quick one to get in the ground, harvest, and you're done. It's very minimal labor, minimal equipment needed. And then if it was me, I would probably start to invest in some of the perennials. So the the daffodils, maybe some lilies, things that are going to give you a long-term investment. If I was starting out, I honestly probably wouldn't jump first into dahlias just because of the amount of kind of labor and care that's needed. But that would just be kind of my personal opinion.
There's a question as to where the handout is located. So Zach will be sending out an email with a link to the presentation as well as a handout. So that will probably be sent out in a few days. There's another question of when do you like to plant your anemones and ranunculus outdoors in Illinois?
Yeah, so typically if I have sometimes I will set up a low tunnel on those raised beds out there. I will get some of those going probably in March, some seasons, if I have that low tunnel going. Otherwise, if I don't do that, I kind of skip anemones and ranunculus, because usually by the time I can get them out, it's more like April if I don't have any kind of low tunnel. And usually it gets hot so quick that I can't get a good crop of them. So unless you have a low tunnel or a hoop house or a greenhouse, I would probably skip it. But otherwise, if you had a low tunnel, I'd probably go for March, but it could be earlier if you have a hoop house or a greenhouse.
I definitely love ranunculus, and I've never had success with them.
I know. I wish,
disappointing.
like, just that would be the one thing. If I had a hoop house, that would be, I would go gangbusters.
Right.
Ranunculus.
Regarding lily bulbs in particular, do you know if how they could store them on the farm to succession plant them biweekly? You mentioned that you could get multiple shippings, but wondering about storing them myself.
Sure. Yeah, you could definitely get a bulk order of them, and either keep them in the cooler or keep them in another cool, dry location, and they would store just fine. Your biggest enemy is going to be moisture. They might mold if they're in a really humid, warm spot for a long period of time. So keep them cool and dry, and you could certainly store those. Yeah.
It's lots of excellent presentations. You did an awesome job.
Oh, good.
Zach did add the PDF for the handout in the chat. It's
Perfect.
around the 12:51 p.m. time mark. So if anyone is interested in that, you can go download it. He also added the link to the Qualtrics survey. So if you don't know how to use the QR code, that's a great way to access the survey as well. For calla lily, the sprout comes from the same end as the roots, top, hence smooth side down. So that's just
Perfect.
a comment to
Thank you, Holly. I
going,
appreciate that.
yeah, helpful. Going back to the bed prep, are you adding fertilizer or other supplements to the soil?
Yeah, compost is my main fertilizer method. I try to get a soil test every year, every couple years to kind of see where I'm at. But in general, since I grow mostly in raised beds and I've brought in the soil for those, what I'll typically do is either add a layer of compost in the fall or add a layer of aged good compost in the spring, whichever I get to it. So for me, compost, any type of organic matter is always going to be the best solution, in my opinion. But always get that soil test so that you know what you need to add. There's no point in adding extra stuff if you get a soil test and you find out you don't need it. So definitely recommend that.
So Diane is asking, what planting mix do you use? Which you just mentioned compost. Is there anything else
Yeah.
that you use?
Yeah, compost mix, great to add into your soil. If you're talking about kind of starting things ahead of time inside, then any just good quality potting mix is going to be good. So a mix of peat moss, perlite, vermiculite, you can get kind of the grower grade, big, larger bags of potting mix. That's typically what I would use in the crates, or if I'm starting dahlias inside. Yeah.
So Fawn had asked, will you keep recording as questions take us past an hour? And yes, we are still recording. So if you do have to go, don't worry about missing out on questions. It's part of the recording, so you'll be able to catch that later. Zach points out that Candice also has another cut flower webinar on our YouTube page. So if you're interested in that, you can access that as well for more information. If I have ranunculus ready to put into pots for greenhouse, when would I start them?
I would start them now. If you have a greenhouse, then get them going now. Yeah, for sure.
To plan out in high tunnel, is there a reliable source for knowing which cultivars are cut and come again?
Most of the time, if you're reading up on the variety, like in the seed catalog or on the seed website, that's a great place to look. Or any kind of cut flower production book is going to give you that information as well. I know ASCFG has a great cut flower book. I use Floret. They have a farm out in Oregon that has really, or Washington, I should say. So get a good reference book, and most of the time they're going to be able to tell you in that harvest section whether it's going to be cut and come again, or it's going to be one crop and things like that. Yeah.
We also have a question about compost. Is there a local market for compost? We thought about trying to sell rabbit waste as well as chicken. We use it all the time on our garden and flowers, and they turn out great.
Yeah, check with your you could check with your local extension office to see if they have a source that they could share with you, or if you have a local, I'm in like a central Illinois flower farmer group on Facebook. If you have a local group of other farmers that you connect with, that would be a great place to check, see if anybody else would be interested.
Let me jump in there. I was going to answer that privately.
Oh, thank you.
I just want to also distinguish the difference between, finished compost
Mhm.
and rabbit and chicken manure, because
Yeah.
those are two distinctive things. But Candice is right. You can probably check with your local extension office to see if there's some outlets in your particular local area. So it really depends.
Perfect. Thanks, Zach.
There were actually two questions that got sent to me privately. One you kind of already answered, related to what you're actually filling your raised beds with, soil, compost. You kind of answered that, but did you start with kind of a custom raised mix blend, or did you just import some local topsoil, or what did you start with?
Yeah, I just started with topsoil. I got a bulk delivery from a local garden center of just good quality dark topsoil, and then I incorporated compost into it. Yeah.
And then the final one was about rotation with the bulbs and annual cut flowers in your raised beds? Do you do anything with rotation with those?
I do, yeah. Like the tulips that I do in the raised beds, I tend to move them around from bed to bed. I actually find it to be really helpful for the soil because that process of planting and then pulling the bulb out, it helps really kind of break up the soil in those beds and work that compost in even better. So I do trend to kind of move them around in those beds. And what's nice about, let's say, the tulips in particular, they're harvested early enough in the season that I can still get an annual crop that I'll plant just in that same bed right after the tulip. So it's not like you're wasting a whole bed for the whole season, which is nice.
Very cool. And I actually had one question. Maybe we can make this the final question because I don't think there's any more. And we're about 10 minutes past.
Yeah.
With the soil test question, nutrient demand. I know like in vegetable crops, like there are certain, crop families that are certain nutrient consumers, like, tomatoes with potassium. Is there any sort of, when you're doing a soil test and looking for balances, particularly with like cations and things, is there something to look for with cut flowers in particular? Like, is potassium a big concern or something like that?
Not really. There aren't really any huge, I would say, ones that stand out over the other, just because it's such a broad group of plants that you're growing. Like there really aren't a ton of similar families even that you're growing. So I would say obviously nitrogen is going to be your biggest thing to have that really good lush amount of growth to cut from. But yeah, beyond that, really nothing super specific.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Candice, and thank you, Katie, for moderating for us today. That was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
No problem. And for those of you that are still on the webinar, there will be an email that's sent out with the archived webinar, as well as the evaluation link. So we really appreciate your feedback and we use it to shape our future webinars. And with that, I hope everyone has a great day and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.